Everyone ready to get started? We have one holdout. If you could please mute your telephone line, that would be great. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now, folks. Good afternoon, or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We have a great group gathered here in Washington, and we have a large group of about 100 folks on the telephone line across the country. I want to welcome you to our program here this afternoon, Developing and Managing a Successful Fundraising Campaign. We're very fortunate to have a really distinguished lineup of speakers here today. But before I introduce them, I want to just thank first off our co-sponsors, in addition to Venable, our law firm. The Greater Washington Society of CPAs is a co-sponsor of this event. We greatly thank them for their co-sponsorship. And they are also handling the CPE credits for the CPAs. And I was told to please, if you complete your CPE form and drop it off at the table on your way out to make sure you get your credit. And also the BDO accounting firm, CPA firm, is our final co-sponsor of today's event. And thank you to Lee Klump for that. Also want to thank our colleague Heather Blakely, who's been very helpful, extremely helpful in getting this program organized and off the ground today. This is a really exciting and interesting topic. We have 4 terrific speakers here today. I'm not going to go through a detailed introduction of them. In your handout materials that you have in front of you, you have detailed bios for each of them. And for those of you on the phone, it was emailed out to you today, I believe. So you should have that as well. But just very briefly, to my immediate right is Paulette Maehara. Paulette was a longtime president and CEO of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. Very distinguished expert in this area, probably knows more about nonprofit fundraising than anyone in the country, and we're very fortunate to be able to hear from her today. Our second speaker is going to be Art Taylor, second from the end there. Art is the president of the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, a very important and interesting organization that both helps prospective donors understand prospective charities that they may want to give donations to, and understand what are the kind of the best outlets for the charitable donations, and also helps the charities themselves meet certain standards and become more attractive to prospective donors. Our third speaker is my colleague Crystalline Lowson, sitting next to Paulette. Crystalline is an associate in our nonprofit organizations group, does a lot of work in connection with nonprofit fundraising from the legal perspective, and is going to talk about some of the legal aspects of nonprofit fundraising. And then finally, on the end is Lee Klump. Lee is with the BDO firm, a very distinguished nonprofit tax and accounting CPA and expert, and is going to be speaking about some of the accounting and tax implications in connection with nonprofit fundraising. A few logistical points. We're going to take questions after each of the speakers is done, because each speaker has fairly distinct topics that they're going to be speaking about. So both here in the room and on the telephone, obviously please unmute your phones if you want to ask questions. We also have a chat feature on the webinar. You can submit questions through that, and I'll be monitoring that and can field those questions as well. So if you want to ask questions through the chat feature on the webinar, just send those in during the course of each speaker's presentations, and then I'll grab those at the end of each presentation. And then, of course, be sure to mute your line again after you ask your question. In terms of the handout materials that you have in front of you, we're going to be on Monday sending out an electronic version of those to everyone, including those of you here in the room and on the telephone. And we'll also have a recording of this presentation that will be linked to that. It will be posted on our website. So if you want to share those with any colleagues, obviously feel free to. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Paulette to get us started. Paulette.
Thank you for the reminder. Before I start, I want my phone to be ringing.
No problem. I was speaking at ASAE Springtime Conference yesterday and forgot to do that, and it's quite embarrassed when the phone went off in the middle of the presentation.
And it was yours, right?
Yes, it was mine.
Well, I've had that happen to me too. Okay. All right. Thank you. So now you tell me I just have to push the little buttons, right?
Right here.
Yay! Works. Well, it's very nice to be. Oh, where's the microphone? Oh. I'm from Texas. I talk with my hands, so I apologize. It's very nice to be here, and I think we have a really interesting combination of speakers today. And I'm going to talk to you about the fundraising piece of it. But in fundraising, there is a group of people that are very much partners in the process. One is your accountants, your chief financial officers. And by the way, how many of you in the room are CFOs?
I spend a lot of time in
or finance people? Okay, we have some brave people out there. There you are.
Yeah.
And then there's the legal side of what we do. So there's both the legal, the finance, and then the obvious asking for the money piece. And it's very much a team effort.
I know.
And that's the way I've always looked at it.
But no, this isn't interactive at all.
Could those of you on the phone who have not muted your phone, please mute your phone?
You can't do anything. And this is ready talk button, but I don't know what that does.
You don't know how to mute your phone?
Does it come through on your speakers on your computer? Other ones have, no problem. You never use two phones on your equipment.
Technology is wonderful, is it not? Well, at any rate, it's a good team effort, and so I think the combination of all of the speakers today are going to really, I think, provide some real meaningful content to all of you. How many of you are at fundraising?
I don't know why it wouldn't be, but of course. Should we meet with the board? Yeah, but the board is Bonnie. Okay. Yeah. That's easy. So it's literally I like blow it and act like it's I can't think of any. We throw it off. And now you work for what they do. Well, this is a scholarship foundation, right? Anyway. So, but I mean, you got like both things going on, right? Yeah. I think it's an easy fit. And how much notice are you going to give? What do you decide about that? So, this is what I'm trying to work out. Before I was going to be evil. Yeah, but our event is the IS event. Oh, right. Stay to that. I thought I'd stay till the 15th because that's actually the last pay period. Yeah, I'd do that. I would do that. Then I look all generous. And I don't do any funky math. I would.
There's no sound for people on the phone.
Right? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Start with the basics. Really? No way, really? This is our PowerPoint presentation? Yeah, I know. Why do we There's not even a clip art on it. People are so addicted to PowerPoint.
What do
For
we do?
no reason at all.
No?
It does not enhance it.
Okay.
Not at all.
All right, let's start with the basics.
Yeah, I told.
I don't know the level of expertise in this room, so if you are at the point where you're starting a campaign or you are just starting a development program or you are in the midst of some very heavy capital campaign planning. So this talk is really geared to pretty much the starting in the middle of the road. For those of you who are much more sophisticated, this is probably too elementary for you. And we can have another conversation about major gift fundraising. I will touch on it, but it is not really part of the presentation today. We really want to start with the basics. And so let's talk about what we think we know about philanthropy. Well, philanthropy is an emotional decision. It is not just a financial decision. Donors want to feel like they are part of something bigger than you or your organization, and most importantly, they want to feel like they're making a difference in the world. And by the way, that is universal. It doesn't matter which cause you may be working for. Donors want to feel that they are doing something that is going to change the world. And you have examples of that every day. And in the newspaper, in listening to Bill Gates speak or Warren Buffett speak, they want to make a difference in the world, and they know that in their case, their money can clearly do that in certain areas that they have interest in. It's a process. It's not an event. So it's a long-term process. Investments follow information, interest, and involvement. And many donors look at their contribution as an investment in whatever cause or issue they may be interested in. And perhaps one of the most important things, people give to people. They don't give to projects. And organizations don't have needs. People have needs. And that's something that many times you forget or you can forget, because I hear organizations talk all the time about how much their organization needs money. Their organization doesn't need money. The people they serve need the money. So remember those things.
Here's what I think. Well, here's what I think. I think
There's no such thing as an average gift. Every organization is different. And in universities, an average gift may be $150,000. In a small organization, it may be $150. So it is very difficult to match or to talk about average giving when you have a very diverse group of people or organizations represented. Success breeds success. Individuals like to be part of successful campaigns or successful fundraising events or successful programs, fundraising programs. And the needs of the donor and the organization must be met. What's important is that, and I'll talk about this in a minute, donor-centric fundraising really speaks to the importance of the donor being at the center of the core of what you do. And sometimes that will present challenges for you because a donor may want to go in a direction the organization doesn't, and then what do you do?
Fine, well that's great.
The biggest mistake that you can ever make is not asking for the money. The number one reason why people don't give is because they haven't been asked. The number one reason why people don't give when asked is because they don't trust the organization. So these are the things that we think we know, and for the most part, are true. Fundraising effectiveness. Now, I will say that some of this I'm going to cover quickly, and hopefully you can hear what I'm saying over the chatter. And then some of the slides I will only touch on or not talk about at all. It's information for you. Each of us has...
The conference has been muted.
Yay! So if I don't cover, you're welcome. If I don't cover a slide or I don't cover a topic that you see of interest, just ask me or grab me after the event. Okay, fundraising effectiveness. Now, for the accountants in the room, you're looking to maximize your return on investment, and that is important. But you have to realize that development programs don't spring up overnight. They don't. Now, you might get lucky and you might have $1 million gift dropped in your lap, but trust me, that does not happen every day. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And so the lowest impact are the things here at the bottom of the arrow. Mass media, direct mail, internet. These are the most expensive things you can do. But for those organizations that do not have fundraising programs, you have to start with a base, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Internet, telephone solicitation, person-to-person is the most effective way of raising money. I would much prefer to go out, if I'm charged with raising $10 million, and ask 10 people for $1 million. It is much more effective, and you know, there's very little investment that you've made other than my time, my energy, and that of your volunteer leadership. So from an effectiveness standpoint, the high-impact things are the high-touch things that we do. And fundraising is about relationship building, and that's the critical core of what fundraising is about. And remember that people give to people. It's kind of the number one or the second golden rule in fundraising. The fundraising process, and I said earlier that process is important. It's important in the legal world and it's important in the accounting world, but it's as important, if not more, in the fundraising world. And it starts, and it's very much secular. It starts with identification, evaluation, interest and involvement, solicitation, commitment, recognition, and renewal, and it all starts again. I'll come back to this in a minute. Finding potential donors. How many of you have heard of the rock in the pond theory? Good. Well, it's very simple. You throw a rock in a pond and you have ripples. In every organization, you have a constituency that is close to you, your board, your volunteer leaders, your senior leadership and your staff as a whole. You have people who are very dedicated to the cause, and that is the first ripple. And then as the ripples go out, You have other constituents that are involved in the cause, whether they be recipients of service or they be individuals who have an interest in the organization. Sometimes those are donors. And so you have a group of people that are already built-in constituents to your cause, but you have to find them. And going back to the process, this is the identification process. So where do we start? I get that question all the time. Well, where do I start looking for donors? Do I go and get a list? And no, you don't do that. You start with the people who are the closest to you. And those, as I said, it could be your board and others that are very dedicated, committed to the organization. The board, by the way, should be giving to your organization. There's another theory that I don't actually have written down, and it's called the 3G principle. It's give, get, or get off. So if the board members are not giving, they need to get off. It's kind of simple. And it's not just giving of personal time. It's giving of your treasure, whether it's $1 or $1 million. And it's also helping you access those individuals who might have an interest in your cause. So it's giving and getting. And it's important because when you go out to ask for money, if the people who are not as committed to your cause as you are not giving to you, why should anybody else? So the rock and the pond theory is really it's a very simplistic way of saying start with the people in the middle and work outward, because every organization has a constituency. You simply have to take the time, energy, and effort to identify who they are. There are a variety of different fundraising programs, and the most basic, the lowest on the totem pole, is the annual giving program. It's the direct mail, it's the internet solicitation, it's very basic, it's the lower end of the giving, but it is the baseline for which you begin to develop your own various levels of fundraising, which could be major gifts, special events, capital campaigns, etc. And they all play a role in the fundraising process. But you have to start somewhere, and that's building the base. And in some cases, if you're starting from scratch, you're not going to see a return on that investment unless you're incredibly lucky within 3 to 4 years, and on average 5 years is pretty typical. So if you're starting at the base, unless you have some already identified very large donors, you will start at a very low level, and eventually you will return on the investment the organization is making in you. But it does take time to build a program. And so every one of these components is very typical of a fundraising program. And in some cases, there are organizations who invest in staff in these programs, and in most organizations today that are raising any type of money are investing in the staff to run these various programs, whether it be one person, and I've done that in my career as a one-person fundraiser, or I have a staff. Harvard has a staff of probably 500 development officers, and every institution has its own way of doing business. But these are typical elements of a fundraising program, and they're all valid. Special events are wonderful public awareness tools for organizations. They recruit volunteers. They are heavily time intensive and don't return as great on the investment. But if you factor in the public awareness into the event, the organization is gaining, the volunteer involvement the organization is gaining, it has tremendous value. And every organization has to make a determination as to what you want to do, where you can spend your time. And does anybody in the group raise money through special events or annual fund, special events, annual fund? Capital campaigns? How many of you have done campaigns? And planned giving programs. Good, good. Well, so there's a mix in the room. Okay. So laying the groundwork. And again, I talked in the beginning about the importance of process. Laying the groundwork for a campaign or a fundraising program is critical. And it begins with strategic planning and looking at the needs of the organization, looking at the mission, the purpose, the vision. Now, many of you have strategic plans already. You've already done that work. This is fancy. So analyzing what your own situation is, in some cases your readiness to raise money is incredibly important in analyzing the situation, and defining the strategic vision for the organization. You know, one of the things that I think is, for me it was a truism, that donors want to hear about the vision and the mission of the organization is important, but they really want to hear about the vision. Where is the organization going to be in 10, 15, 20 years? Because if you think about the donor who is looking at the organization as an investment, they want their investment to live long past their involvement in the organization. So defining a strategic vision is important. And then doing the needs analysis in your organization and prioritizing those needs. And then once you do that, that helps you begin to analyze the potential funding sources that you may have and that you need to identify or find a relationship either on your board or through your volunteer leadership as a whole, where those relationships might lie and who is the best person to potentially pick the organization's cause and purpose. And from this, you can look at a variety of different funding perspectives. And I'm not going to talk much about the government funding, although for some organizations, government funding is a very big part of what they do. Universities, for instance, have a very large pool of government money. Typically, it's in grant monies for very specific programs. But the private sector is, in the university world, the private sector money or philanthropy is the margin of excellence. It is what will take you over the top, above and beyond what you have in student fees, tuition, government grants, etc. Did I do that right? Yes, I did. Oh, good. This is cute. All of these things help you prepare a case. The case for support is why people should give to you. You know, it would be wonderful if you just waltzed out and said, you know, you should give me money. I used to work for an organization called Project Hope. And Project Hope started in the 50s. It was founded by a man by the name of William Walsh, Dr. William Walsh. And Dr. Walsh was a great visionary. He convinced Dwight Eisenhower to give him a ship, the USS Hope. It was renamed and rechristened the USS Hope. And that ship went around the world teaching and teaching medical education, new techniques in medical surgeries, heart procedures, etc., around the world. And Dr. Walsh was a great visionary. He could convince anybody to give him anything. And he really didn't need a case. He was the case. He was a walking case. And when I got to Hope, we had no case statement. We really had not a lot except Dr. Walsh, and Dr. Walsh was retiring. So he was an incredible individual for me to work with because he was truly one of these people gifted that if asked, anybody would give him anything. I was always constantly amazed at him. But being able to articulate the needs of your organization, whatever it may be, is extremely important. So a case document can be 3 paragraphs or it can be 3 pages. It really shouldn't be 50 because no donor is going to read 50 pages. And sometimes it's very specialized, depending on what you're raising money for. The other thing you want to do is test the case. See if it makes any sense, number one, to the people that you're going to be asking. And donors, by the way, love to tell you this stuff. How many of you have ever done a feasibility study? Great. So you know when you do a feasibility study and you go out and you talk to the donors about raising money for a particular building or a particular issue, donors will tell you how they feel. So testing your case is extremely important, and all of the pieces that precede this really help you hone and refine your case. Adjust. Sometimes you need to take a step back. And it is the hardest thing to do when you've got a feasibility study that tells you that you shouldn't and won't be successful in raising money for a particular cause, let's say a building. And I experienced that in my career. The feasibility study told the Red Cross in Hawaii not to raise the money to build this building. They did it anyway, and it took years to pay that building off. But sometimes you have to readjust, and you, most importantly, should listen to what your donors are telling you, because they will tell you and they will be very honest with you. So adjusting is extremely important. And then in the major gift element, from a major gift perspective, then you're designing a plan and you're acting on that plan. But major gifts is really the culmination of all of these things, and having a base to work with, a donor base to work with from a major gift perspective is really important. And recency and frequency and all the things you hear in the fundraising lingo is extremely important when it comes to raising big dollars. And again, that's really at the high end of the effectiveness chart, and it's the high end of the pyramid. And of course, you know, tracking and reporting results. Tracking and reporting results is extremely important, and I lump all of that under the banner of stewardship. Stewardship is incredibly important and should not ever be shortchanged. It's one thing to ask for money. You know, 90% of what we do, 95% of what we do is planning, and the stewardship piece of this is asking. The asking is the easy part, folks. It's the stewardship piece that's hard. And that's where accounting and their accounting folks and your legal team are very much part of the process. Involving them in the beginning in whatever you do is extremely important, because you are a team. You have different jobs, but you are a team when it comes to the stewardship piece. And I said earlier that the number one reason why people don't give when asked is because they don't trust the organization. So the trust factor takes years to build and minutes to tear down. You can never overlook and shortchange the stewardship piece. So there are 6 elements to be successful in any fundraising program. You have to have a need. You have to have a compelling case. You've got to have good leadership, sufficient prospects, so again, the rock in the pond theory, and a good detailed plan of action and sound management. Those are really critical elements in any fundraising program, whether it be very basic to very sophisticated. Now, I'm going to skip the visioning part, because I think that's pretty self-evident, but I do want to speak, again, a few minutes on the compelling case, because the case, again, it's your marketing tool for your organization. And it really helps to establish your identity, separate and apart. And I think most of you know the statistics. The nonprofit sector in the United States alone is huge. We've got almost 1.3 million, or whatever the latest number is from the IRS, C3 organizations in the United States. And that doesn't include the 83,000 registered charities in Canada and the several hundred thousand registered and unofficial charities in Mexico, and then you lump in all of the others, the NGOs from around the world. It's a huge sector. and it's growing by leaps and bounds every day. So establishing a unique identity for your organization is extremely important when you're developing your case. Leadership is also extremely important, and never underestimate it. You need to have people of influence and people who are willing to use their influence. And it requires a lot of relationship building and leveraging relationships. You've got a board, they have relationships. And learning to leverage relationships is part of the fundraising process. And as I said earlier, fundraising is about relationship building, but it's leveraging existing relationships in your organization as well. Whether they be an existing donor, a board member, or your CEO, everyone has relationships, so learn to leverage them. Sufficient prospects. Well, this slide is really geared more to the major gift aspect of fundraising. But again, going back to the rock in the pond theory, building a pool of donors helps you begin to have a sufficient pool of prospects to build on for major gifts or for larger gifts. And most organizations today will start with either some sort of internet solicitation, which, by the way, is extremely effective, and it's very cost-effective. And today, more and more donors are becoming used to giving online. Now, there is definitely a generational gap between those who are comfortable giving online and those who still want to write that check. But younger donors, and I would say people under the age of 55, are pretty comfortable giving online. And you see this all the time, especially in disaster relief efforts. I spent 14 years of my career raising money for the Red Cross, and I can tell you that in a disaster, emotions speak louder than anything else. It is very much an emotional response. I used to call it money collecting, not money raising, because literally that's what we did. We collected the money. And in today's world, with texting and all of the other social media that is available, building a base of donors is relatively easy. Building it is not hard. It's keeping them involved and moving them up the donor pyramid that's the challenge. I think a plan of action is probably pretty self-evident. You don't really need a lot of help there, but sound management, I think, is extremely important, and that can be your CEO, that can be your chief financial officer or your finance officer, your legal team. Sometimes legal expertise in a nonprofit organization comes from a pro bono lawyer who works with the organization or sits on your board, but that's where you build this team of people that can help manage the relationships, the donor monies, in a very effective way. Never overlook the use of volunteers. Again, in today's world, more and more fundraisers are asking for money. And part of that has to do with the amount of time involved, the timeliness of the ask, but never underestimate the use of volunteers in the process, because board members are very good fundraisers if you train them. And what's important, though, is when you train them, make sure that you find out who likes to raise money and who doesn't. Because some board members don't mind asking for money while others do. My best example of that is when I worked again for Project Hope. We had a stellar board of individuals, mostly CEOs of companies, and Jack Welch was on our board, and he at the time was the president and CEO of GE. So Jack and I were doing some fundraising together, and the first thing we did, I said, Jack, are you comfortable? Here's what we're going to do. Here's the prospect. Here's the information. We had a game plan going in, and we had about 10 minutes with this individual. This was one of Mr. Welch's peers. We had about 10 minutes, and we had it all planned, exactly what was going to happen when, and at the end, Jack was going to ask for the money. So they get to talking about golf. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, the time is going by. It's, we're not going to get to the ask. And it was a big number. So I'm sitting there and I'm, you cannot kick Mr. Welch under the table. You just can't do it. So I'm sitting there, sweat is just pouring down, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is never going to work. And so at the end, he thanks us for coming. It was a great chat, Jack. Thank you for introducing me to Paulette. It was a wonderful time. And I got out of there and said, Mr. Welch, you didn't ask for the money. He said, oh, I forgot to tell you, I don't really like to do that. So I said to him, okay, Mr. Welch, from now on, you talk, I ask. But volunteers can be extremely good. And in his case, he made the case beautifully. From that point forward, we were the greatest team together. It was wonderful. But you've got to learn those things up front. It's painful to learn them as you're sitting there. Okay. And then you have the accounting, and this is the stewardship piece. Donor intent. What did the donor intend to do with money? And in today's world, in the fundraising world, donor intent has become more and more of an important and crucial and, by the way, litigated issue. I'm sure many of you have heard all the various cases from Princeton to the University of Chicago where donors have come back and said, or donors' families have come back and said, you're not honoring the intent of the original gift, and oh, by the way, we want the money back. And when it's millions and millions of dollars, that's a huge issue for the organization. So donor intent is extremely important, and the fundraising person who's creating the relationship has built a bond of trust with that donor. And if that fundraiser says, we're going to use the money for the purpose in which it was solicited, they have to live by that, and the AFP Code of Ethics requires them to live by that. And if you want to change the intent, and I've had that conversation with lawyers and with accountants in the past, yes, you could probably do that from a legal a legal perspective, maybe not if there's a donor instrument or a donor agreement. But from an accounting perspective, you might be able to do that. But from a stewardship perspective and a trust perspective with your donor and an ethical perspective, you should not, unless the donor gives you permission. So donor intent is an extremely important issue. You cannot overlook it. And donors have to be engaged and involved, or donors' families, heirs, etc., if there is a desire to change donor intent. In today's world, I tell fundraisers, never write a donor instrument in perpetuity. Buildings crumble, and we see, all around us examples of buildings that bear the name of people who have been indicted or, have left the country because they've been indicted and charged with a crime, and by the way, found guilty of a crime. So never write a donor instrument in perpetuity. Most, especially universities and hospitals today, are writing donor instruments probably that last no longer than the potential life of the building or the instrument that they are funding. It could be 6 months, it could be 15 years. But, those things change. So be aware of those kinds of things as you speak to donors, especially if you're talking about either a restricted gift of some sort, like a capital gift, like a endowment program, etc. And be especially cautious, because stewardship in this area really goes to the heart and core of who the organization is and what you do. I can't help but think, the Princeton case that occurred has been so talked about in the philanthropic world, and I suspect in other media as well. I can't help but think that the donors and the institution have suffered as a result, at least to some degree. And so the more that you can do to listen to your donor, honor donor intent, the better off you are. Restrictions, gift restrictions, again going back to donor intent, and whatever the donor is restricting, there is an accounting procedure for that, and I know Lee will speak to that. There's also legal implications as it relates to donor restrictions. The management piece, again, managing gifts is extremely important. All of these pieces are wrapped together, and the end word here is the A word, accountability. It's all about being accountable for what you do. Do what you say you're going to do. That's kind of a golden rule. And the independent sector, and by the way, Sarah Melendez is here. I don't know how many of you know Sarah. Sarah was the former president of the independent sector, and she and I worked together in my early years in AFP. But independent sector and AFP, along with a number of other organizations, developed a very important document called the Donor Bill of Rights. If you don't know about it, it's easy to get a copy. You can go on Independent Sector's website, you can go on the AFP website and download that. Donors love this. It tells the donors what their rights are. And again, it all wraps into being accountable and being a good steward of your donor's money. So if there's a message that I could leave you with today, it's stewardship and accountability, because those are the things that speak to the heart of who you are and what you do. I'm not going to go into this piece. This is all about recording, tracking, and reporting of gifts, but it is important, and it's the back end of the development process. And some people say, well, it's the boring end. Well, but it's the important end. Tracking and making sure that you know and have over a historical period gift information about your donors is extremely important. Fundraisers come and go. So does the CEO or the leadership and your volunteers. But your tracking system, your database, whatever database system you may choose to use, is extremely important. And finally, I would say there are some real key benefits to developing a fundraising program, whatever you choose to do. Obviously, it provides additional resources. It can do that in 3 to 5 years, or it can do that immediately, depending on where you are in your fundraising process. I think I referred to this earlier as the margin of excellence. Some institutions, particularly those that have are fee-based or have other means of revenue, it is the margin of excellence. It allows you to do things that you might not be able to do without it. You develop stronger relationships. There's a public awareness of the organization and who you are and what you do. Obviously, you develop a group of volunteers, again, who are very committed to the cause and what you do. You develop a pool of prospects, whether they be board members or potential prospects as a result of a relationship. And I'm not just speaking today, by the way, of individual giving, but obviously corporate giving and foundation giving is very much a part of the overall fabric of who gives money. But in the final analysis, in the $300 billion that was given to philanthropy in 2009, that's the latest statistics we have from Giving USA, 74% of that money comes from individuals. It allows you to enhance your skills. You might have acquire, or you might be able to build on your development staff. And it allows you to build a base, whether it be annual giving, which then is the base for the other types of giving that you may seek to do. And it obviously it will lay the groundwork for a future campaign. And I got to tell you, everybody has a campaign. In your lifetime, you will have a campaign. And then you will have another campaign. For those development people in the room, you know that our life is one endless campaign. And, you know, we live from campaign to campaign. But, you know, I've been a fundraiser over 35 years of my career, and I have loved every single minute of it. And the people that I have worked with in my career have just been remarkable. From the volunteer side, like Mr. Welch, to the staff and to the professionals that are members of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. So it's a great way to have a career. And by the way, if you need a career, fundraising is a great career. There are not enough people in the profession today, and the numbers speak for itself, where you've got 1.3 million C3s here in the United States alone. Let's just say half of those really are raising money. That's still a lot of nonprofit organizations. You factor in all of the others from all over the world, and they're all competing for talented people. So if you want a job and you want to see the world, be a fundraiser. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm sorry I've talked so fast, but I had a lot of material to cover.
Yep. Go ahead. Well, if you can repeat the question.
Okay.
I had a question about this. The act, specifically for an upstart nonprofit, they have the vision. Try to make the act before you implement it, or you wait a couple years and get by on a budget and then make the act. You need upfront money as well to
Sure.
get your program.
Sure. The question was the timeliness of the ask. Do you ask at the beginning, especially if you're a startup organization, and maybe before the vision's actually visioned, or do you ask after the vision and the strategic planning process has been completed? And the answer is both. Remember, you've got a group of people who are already committed to you, and those people have relationships. And remember also that people give to people. So you could have a potential group of people who are willing to give to you as the visioning is happening. A lot of times organizations use grant money for startup, and many foundations are more than happy to give startup money. Remember though, foundation money is not permanent, and neither is government money. Those two sources are what I would call elusive money. They come and go. But they are good for startup. And so although foundations do like to see the visioning piece, the plan piece, they're not necessarily going to give you money just because you ask for it. But you do have a core group of people who are committed to you. So the answer is a little bit of both. And the more complete you are in your visioning and your planning process, typically the more successful you will be. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
That wouldn't apply to land, though, would it? I mean, you would ask for land.
The question is, we were talking about donor instruments in perpetuity, and would that apply to land? The answer is no, it would not. However, there are issues with land contributions, and they have to do with mineral rights. And some donors will give land, but they won't give the mineral rights. And so there are unique issues that are associated with gifts of land. And I would encourage you, unless you're the World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy or others who is part of your core business, I would encourage you to walk that path slowly. And especially gifts and other kinds of gifts in kind, like boats and things like that. Be careful. But the answer is no. Is it for you? No. Yes, sir.
Similar to the first question, actually. As donors are looking at charitable giving as more of an investment and less of a charitable give, it seems like the same people are funding the same kind of breakthrough nonprofits are getting all the donations. The same folks are on them, and particularly if you're with a smaller nonprofit that's struggling to break through, it's like, you're going to invest in Apple stock, or you're going to put money in deli that opens the corner. You're going to go with Apple every time. How do you break through when there isn't the high return that you pick the right small company? You make that argument.
Yeah, the question is, for those of you on the phone, how do you break through? How do you distinguish yourself when you have, especially if you're a small organization and donors that are giving to your or to other organizations or the potential pool for your organization? So how do you distinguish yourself? You know, it is a challenge, and I won't say any differently. And that's where the planning piece comes in, where I think it's critically important for a small organization to really understand the niche you have. And I will say this at the same time, some of you will not like what I'm about to say, and I've been a proponent for this for years, we have too many nonprofit organizations that are duplicating their mission. And if you don't think so, just ask some of your donors. So when you go to your donors, and especially those people that are giving to other causes in the community, make sure that your mission is pretty unique, or collaborate with someone on the potential or the issue that you're dealing with. Because there are more organizations than there probably needs to be. But distinguishing yourself and making yourself unique is important. But make sure you know what the marketplace is. Make sure you know who's doing what in the area that you're serving. If you're a soup kitchen, understand your market niche. This is about marketing 101, folks. I mean, truly, and really some of the business principles apply here. Understand your competition and understand how you then can set yourself apart from the competition. And, you know, you're not going to compete with an arts institution, but you will be asking the same donors who are supporting the arts institution to support your organization. The other piece of that is understanding who your donors are and understanding what's important to the donor. So prospect research on the donor is extremely important. And in today's world, anything public is Googleable. Is that a word?
Googleable.
Anyway, that's a Paulette word. You can find out almost anything about an individual by Googling them. And, you know, you can find out some really interesting things like divorces and, you know, things like that. But if there's a public record on them, you can find that out. So understanding what's important to the donor is really important, especially for a small institution who really is trying to break through and grow and become more of a force in the community. That's where you have to spend upfront time understanding the donor, whether it be a foundation. You know, don't waste your time going to the Ford Foundation if you're a soup kitchen, because, by the way, they're not going to fund you. Or the MacArthur Foundation. That's not what they do. And the Foundation Center is a great resource. It has, you know, a searchable database online that can help you. You don't have that necessarily with your donors, individual donors, I should say, but you do. There is a wealth of information that exists about people. So the more you know about your donor prospects, the more successful you will be. But I won't sugarcoat it. It is tough. It is a challenge, especially in the marketplace today. And I do want to say one thing about globalization, because it's had a huge impact, I think, on the world of philanthropy. You know, with the internet today and with the ability, the social media that exists out there, there are no borders. The only challenge for donors who want to give overseas or vice versa is the currency conversion and the tax laws. And we haven't quite figured out the tax laws yet, you know, especially in the EU, which is very complex. But what's happening for big donors is that they don't care about the tax issues. They're giving anyway. And so it's a very large world today. The pool is much bigger than the community you sit in.
Paulette, this is Jeff Tenenbaum. For those of you on the phone, I would just add one other comment. One trend that we've been seeing from the legal perspective, in light of the kind of increasing crowded market that there is in the charitable world and the increasingly tight competition for scarce dollars, is an increasing number of mergers joint ventures and other kind of combinations between charities and, frankly, other types of nonprofit organizations as well, even in the membership association world. We've seen more in recent years than at any time that I can remember, and not just full-out mergers, but sorts of joint programs and joint activities, joint fundraising campaigns, other things like that. So if you are one of those small organizations that's having trouble competing against a larger organization in your field, consider approaching them and working out some kind of arrangement. Perhaps it's a full-on merger where they agree to create a separate division within their organization and give you certain rights and a committee or a council to oversee that body, or maybe it's you're going to do things together but remain separate. There's lots of different ways, there's lots of different vehicles through which to accomplish these sorts of things, but you should really consider that as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I, personally, I'd like to see much more of that happen.
Okay, we did have a question from the line from the chat feature. It's kind of the age-old question that everyone asks, and Art, I know, is going to be talking about this in his presentation. But the question is, as a rule, what percentage of your money raised should be used for the purpose of fundraising?
Oh, I love that question. And it's a great legal answer. You're going to love this one, Jeff. It depends. And I'm serious about that. There is no magic answer here. If you are a small startup organization, you're principally relying on direct mail and telephone solicitation, your startup costs are going to be high and probably well over 60%. It doesn't mean that your organization isn't doing good work. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, when they started, had incredibly high fundraising costs, probably exceeded 70%. But yet, look at the difference they made in a very short period of time. Now, that's changed over time for them. As the organization becomes older, more mature, and has more mature fundraising, and has larger gifts coming in at the top, the more effective they are, the fundraising costs go down. So the older the institution, the more mature fundraising program, the costs are lower and should be. So if you're the Red Cross, you probably shouldn't have fundraising costs that are 70%. But if you are a startup soup kitchen, that's going to be the case. But it doesn't mean that the work that you do isn't valuable in the community. And so I can't tell you that there's one magic number. I know what Art will tell you, and I know what the Combined Federal Campaign will say, and the United Way will say, that you should have fundraising costs at least under 35%. But the reality, folks, is when you're a startup organization, that's almost impossible to do. Now, the good thing is that BBB and other watchdog organizations understand, and they have a methodology to get you there. And obviously, you want to get there. I mean, the more you can put into the program, the better you serve the constituents you're there to serve. But the reality is that it will depend on the type of organization that you are involved with or that you will be involved with.
Okay, let me just unmute the lines here on the telephone, see if anyone has any questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Yeah, it is dangerous, but at least we know how to mute it again. Does anyone have any questions on the telephone? And while we're waiting, see, there's one question. Maybe not. Okay, it sounds like we're questions. We're finished with Paulette's presentation. We're going to move on to Art.
The conference has been muted.
Bear with us for those of you, well, from both places. The slides are in the wrong order, so we're going to advance this through to Art's portion of the presentation.
Well, good afternoon. Really great hearing Paulette's presentation. It was a very thorough job she did to orient those of you who wanted to know more about fundraising and the process for achieving this, and she did a great job. I want to thank Jeff and Venable for hosting the event, and the Washington Society, obviously, for participating in this and allowing the accountants in the group who need CPE credits to get them. I happen to be an accountant, although I've long since given up on getting CPE credits. But I think there were some real benefits that came out of my career as an accountant. I also happen to have the dubious distinction of being a lawyer. Although I've never practiced law for a living, I can say that the work that I learned as a lawyer has helped me in this particular job of analyzing charities. But the accountants, I will say, left me one good thing. That was an introduction to this sector. I used to do audits of nonprofit organizations, and that's actually how I got connected to the nonprofit sector. And so even though I was only an average accountant, and they probably wanted me out of that profession anyway, it led to something good happening for me. Again, Paulette, I was really excited to hear your presentation, and it's always fun to be with her. Paulette is the former, as you know, head of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, just recently retired. And I had the pleasure of working with Paulette on the AFP Ethics Committee. There's a committee with the Association of Fundraising Professionals that actually monitors what AFP members do. And there's a code of conduct that they have to agree to adhere to. And if they don't, members may report them. And when they get reported, they come to the Ethics Committee, and we determine how they should be handled, whether they should be kicked out, suspended, sanctioned, or otherwise. And I thought I should mention that because most people don't understand how hard fundraisers work, not only to raise money, but to do it ethically. And when you think of the mission of AFP, I'm giving you a commercial, Paula, but when you think of the mission of AFP, it's not only to teach fundraisers how to do their work, but it's also to encourage ethical behavior among fundraisers. And so when I was offered a chance to sit on that committee, I was very excited to do so, and again, work with Paulette.
People on the phone are having trouble hearing.
All right. Secondly, I wanted to just be thankful because Paulette is also now a member of our board. So I got to work with her, and now she's getting to work with me. She's retired, but I get to see her still, so it's wonderful. I put some slides together to sort of pick up where Paulette really left off. And as you heard her say toward the end of her presentation, it's really all about stewardship, and it's about accountability. And certainly what watchdogs purport to do is to keep organizations accountable to the public, to make sure that they're handling their stewardship responsibilities effectively. And there are a number of different approaches to doing that, everything from evaluating charities based on a few financial ratios to more extensive work like we do to evaluate charities in relation to a set of accountability standards that were developed broadly in the sector. And so I'm going to talk about our work dealing with donors and charities and the work we do to try to get them together. And I think you'll see in this how the approaches can differ and why. So first, just a little bit about our organization and its history. Someone talked about a little bit ago, Jeff was talking about the importance of merging when organizations are doing the same work. Well, there were two organizations that became one to create the Wise Giving Alliance. There was the National Charities Information Bureau that was founded in 1918, and then there was the Better Business Bureau's Philanthropic Advisory Service, which was created in 1971. As the years went on, both of these organizations were evaluating charities in relation to very similar standards. Most of the charities they were evaluating were very similar. And the outcomes of those evaluations were, for the most part, consistent. What was also true was both of those organizations were going out of business because they didn't have a revenue stream. And someone came up with the wise idea of merging them and creating the Wise Giving Alliance. But you see, between those two organizations, there's a lot of experience and a lot of background in dealing with charities. And I must say that history means a lot when it comes to dealing with specific organizations. We have great relationships with organizations, both ones who meet our standards and those who don't. And I think one of the really happy examples of that is when organizations don't meet our standards, there are no lawsuits. There are no public criticisms of our standards by and large. It is simply an understanding that, we dealt with them fairly and openly, and the standards weren't met, and maybe next time they will. So what is our role? Well, we view our role obviously distinct from what lawyers do and what people in the legal community do, or regulators. We're not trying to determine if a charity is legal per se. What we are trying to do is to enhance public trust. We're trying to create a world in which people can trust charities because of the work we encourage charities to do to earn that trust. We have ethical practices that we want to see charities live up to, and obviously we want to be able to address donor concerns. When you think of how we go about dealing with charities, our charity review process is pretty open. It is a system that is based on inquiries generally. When we go out and do a report on a charity, it's based on the fact that someone has called us about that organization and asked us if we would collect this information on a particular charity and put out a report. Nowadays, though, charities can request that we evaluate them, and we're seeing that more and more, particularly among smaller organizations who want to compete with the big boys. Lots of smaller organizations want to show they can meet tough standards, just like the American Red Cross and some of the larger organizations. A distinction about our reports is that we don't comment on the worthiness of a particular charity's mission, although I get letters just about every so often from people who want to know how Planned Parenthood could meet our standards when from time to time they commit abortions, or people who want to know why we would allow certain animal rights organizations to not meet standards, even though they're out there protecting these great animals. We don't view it our role to comment on what the mission of the organization is, and so or the worthiness of that particular charity's cause. Charities participate with us on a voluntary basis, so we can't force anybody to provide us with any information to do the evaluation, and we need quite a bit of information in order to complete an evaluation. So again, that history that we have of working with organizations over the years is a reason that we can get information from as many as we do. Now, as I said, I would talk a little bit about how our approach differs from that of some other watchdogs. What you'll see out there are organizations that will do ratings of charities based on information that you can get from a 990, mostly public financial information. And what they do with that information is they will compile certain ratios. So they will tell you how much money a charity spends on fundraising, or how much they spend on admin, and how much they spend on program. And then they'll do rankings of charities or award points or stars or letter grades based on how well those charities have performed, in their opinion, on those financial ratios. I guess it has some value. In my opinion, it's very limited, though, because, as Paulette said, who's to say what the right amount is for a charity to spend on these various pieces of activity? A new charity might have to spend more in the beginning than a charity that's been around. And even for charities that have been around a long time, to say that one that spends 90 cents out of the dollar on on program is better than one that spends 85 cents on a dollar toward program wouldn't be too factual necessarily. I think you would need a lot more information besides those ratios to know if that were true. And so when we see these reports, we sort of say, well, I guess they have some value for some people, but they don't have a lot of value for me anymore, because I know that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I think we've all got to do more to encourage the public and ourselves to get off of that drug. The financial ratio drug is just one that is not working. And in fact, I think it can lead to false positives. There are many ways to report higher program costs, whether that be through your joint cost allocations or other approaches. In fact, some organizations that may want to be more aggressive in how they report their program costs could do so, while an organization that is being truthful might report lower program costs. You would be supporting the one that reported the higher costs, even though they were being aggressive and probably a little, outside the bounds of ethics. So you're actually encouraging organizations to race to a number rather than focus on what they really should be doing and accomplishing a mission. And I think that we've all got to be mindful of that and frown upon it when we see it and stop reporting it. So nonetheless, what we try to do is focus less on financial ratios and more on issues that go to whether a charity is truly accountable and open to the public in terms of how they provide information, how they're governed, and a whole variety of other things, which you'll see. So some of our charity reporting activities include these things and some aspects that you should know. These are evaluative reports based on 20 standards, which I'm going to talk about. The Wise Giving Alliance, my organization, evaluates national charities for the most part, but there are local BBBs, about 40 of them, local Better Business Bureaus, that evaluate local charities. And New York City, for instance, has a very large program, St. Louis, and there's some other cities that I could name that do local charity review. And the system, the Better Business Bureau system, is going to have a very intense discussion very soon about how we can take this nationwide, because we know that with so many more charities out there, people want to know more about what's going on locally. The other point is that it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between a local and a national charity. If you're fundraising on the internet, you're a national charity as far as I'm concerned, because anybody might find you anywhere. We do try to take some time to educate donors on wise giving practices. We publish a magazine that comes out 3 times a year. There's usually a very good article in there that covers some aspect of giving, and we put out tips and other good information on our website, which you can find at give.org. There's never any charge for our charity evaluation. So a charity comes to us, they provide information, we do an evaluation that's totally free of charge. There is no fee at all for a charity to get evaluated by us. And it's very important that you know that, because we do have a service that we do charge for, and I'll get into that, but it's not for the evaluation. And in order to be privileged to get charged, you also have to have met all of our standards. So we'll talk about that. No? Okay. So there's also no charge for a donor to access our reports. They're all listed on the website, give.org. Now, how did we come up with these standards that we use? You see here it was a pretty extensive process. It involved a lot of people. We got feedback from donors, from charities. We did a large survey of the donating public to determine what their appetite was for various types of information from charities. We did a survey of small businesses. And so all of these steps had to be completed before we felt comfortable even getting to the point of a draft and then finally releasing those standards back in 2003. It was a very, very long and extensive process. Now, I'll also say I was comfortable when independent sector, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, released the principles and practices for accountability as well. And those principles track very closely with what we came up with. So I found that was a sort of confirmation that what we were doing was well done, because both of those bodies of work were not done together; they were done separately. So, what do the standards cover? There are 20, as I said, and the 4 major areas that they cover are governance and oversight, effectiveness, finances, fundraising, and information materials. And again, you can see them by going to the website. So I'm going to go into a little detail on a few, and you can find the rest of them. And I also included in the materials a complete text of these standards so you can have them with you. In the area of governance and oversight, we require the board to review the audit, the 990, and the budget. The board should meet, and they should have a requisite number of people. We say 5. And no more than 10% of them should be compensated. 1 person or 10%, whichever is more. And there should be no conflict of interest transactions. Now, I could go into a lot of detail about the whole issue of conflict of interest. I won't today. But we do spend a lot of time with organizations that have issues relative to conflicts of interest to try to resolve them in a way that would have them meet standards, or to advise them so that they could meet them next time around. When it comes to effectiveness, one of the things we found out a few years ago when we did these standards was that people really wanted to know if an organization was effective in meeting its mission. Now, they didn't necessarily want to read about it, but they wanted to know if that was an effective organization. And so we came up with 2 standards asking organizations to establish a policy of reviewing their own effectiveness once every 2 years, and then sharing a report of that work with their board of directors. Obviously, we could have gone a lot further, and in fact, we will be very soon releasing some work, again with IS and GuideStar this time, to allow organizations to provide information to us, answers to 5 questions that go to how effective they are in meeting their mission, or how impactful they are as organizations. That project is called Charting Impact, and I would encourage you to look out for it. We'll be releasing that within the next month or so. So you'll want to be mindful of charting impact. It's a way for you to provide information that will show the public that you're effective in meeting your mission. And in the area of finances, we do track financial ratios, but we have more of a threshold approach to it. And I'm not going to defend it too harshly, because I am actually pushing my colleagues to get away from this altogether. I just don't think in today's world we need to be doing a whole lot of this. And if my colleague, my good colleague back at the office, who's been doing this most of his life, heard me say this, he would probably ask me to explain myself. But I'll explain it to you because there's so many more things we need to be focusing on with these organizations. Then I think that these ratios are really a distraction. The reality is only about 7 to 10%, depending on the year, organizations we evaluate don't meet a financial ratio. So reality is most organizations are fine anyway that we evaluate. The organizations that are out there in front of the public soliciting have found a way to at least meet these standards. It is very hard, therefore, for me to stand here and say that this is actually providing some value. So just look for us to continue to push on that. You have to understand, though, that the public still has a very, very heavy appetite for financial ratios. And I do suppose people would want to know if an organization was only spending 10 cents on program. They might still support them, but they would certainly want some insight into what was going on in that organization that would make them only spend 10 cents on program. But again, we have some ratios. Here they are, and that's where we'll leave that. The audit report requirement is an important one, I think. It's also one, frankly, that we're looking at raising because so many charities these days are small, but you know, the audit threshold really hasn't gone up in a number of years, and I know these audits can be expensive for organizations. So we're considering what we might raise that audit threshold to and give some organizations some relief. But organizations that are too small to meet that threshold are at least required to have a limited review or a compilation by some external entity. And those are usually a lot less expensive for organizations. Solicitations and information materials, I think we really cut our teeth as an organization in this particular area. If organizations are telling you the truth, that's probably the most important thing you could hope for, because the work they're doing is very tough in many cases. You're talking about feeding people and educating young people who have all sorts of problems, and you know the work that is going on out there with organizations, very intractable problems they're trying to solve. And the likelihood of them hitting on every single goal is probably not high. But if they're telling you the truth, you can sort of feel good about supporting them. And so we really pay a lot of attention to what charities say in their appeals. Are you being truthful to your mission? Are you spending money the way you're soliciting it? So that in the end, we can kind of get a sense of what donors were expecting of you and what you were actually delivering. And that's, again, a very different question than are you effective in meeting your mission. The question here is, are you trying in the way that you said you would? And so we spend quite a bit of time going into the appeals of organizations. We have certain requirements that they must disclose in their annual reports and in the websites if they are soliciting money on those websites. And we also want to make sure that they're handling donor privacy fairly, and there are certain disclosures that are made in cause-related marketing arrangements that they have with businesses. I assume most of you know what I mean when I say cause-related marketing arrangements. Well, there are these situations that many charities are in nowadays where you go to Macy's and you buy a tie, and if you buy that tie, a certain percentage of it will go to a charity. Well, we have certain requirements that we encourage charities to make that discloses the nature of that relationship. We want to know exactly how much money will go to the charity from that purchase price. We want to know how long the campaign will run, and we want to know if there's a maximum or minimum amount that has to be purchased before the charity will get any. The way we go about doing our reviews is through an online charity evaluation process. And charities enter this information online, the data is automatically evaluated, and then staff get heavily involved at the point of that preliminary report. And they go through it very carefully to see areas that may be out of compliance. And then we get into a serious dialogue with the charity to make sure that what they reported is what they meant, and by the end, we get a report generated. The final thing I'll talk about is this charity seal that we have. There are a number of charities now, over 350, that have our charity seal. In order to get this seal, you have to have been accredited by us. And as I said before, the accreditation process is free. But if you want to use the seal to market your organization, then you have to pay a fee. So I want to make sure everyone leaves here understanding that the evaluation is free, the posting of the report is free, and it doesn't matter whether you meet standards or not, you will get that done. But if you want to have this seal, you do have to pay for it, and you have to have met all those standards. So I wanted to make sure that people understood how we operated that seal program, and there's a lot more information on it, again, on our website. So, okay, I guess if there are any questions, I can go backwards.
Yeah, that's perfect. Anyone have any questions for Art? Yeah.
Trying to get away from that. And I know probably a number of us have gotten calls from a number of organizations, donations, some of which we've heard of, some of which we've never heard of. And one of my first questions is always, the fundraiser, how much do you get, how much donation? And if it's way out of bounds in terms of my personal viewpoint, I would not give money to it. May indeed be a very small, deserving organization, but their fundraiser, their lack of internal resources prevents them from raising their own funds. Can you give us some insight into that?
Sure.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, okay. The question is, I think the question really has to do with phone solicitors and the amounts that phone solicitors will keep as a result of the funds that they raise. This is a tricky area to a certain extent because, first of all, phone soliciting is very expensive. Most charities use phone soliciting for good purposes, which are they're trying to acquire new donors, and that's fine. So it's a small piece of their fundraising program. It's not the entire fundraising program. But there are organizations that use phone solicitors exclusively. It's their entire fundraising program. And I think people get concerned when 80–90% of the money is going to go to a fundraiser versus the charity. But I think if the organization can explain that this is not our entire fundraising program, this is what we do to acquire some new donors, that's a very different use than it is of a phone solicitor for a fundraising campaign entirely. So, I think, and there are some organizations, obviously, that are notoriously bad for using that means of fundraising. And I don't know, Paulette may have some comments about that as well.
Well, there's a difference between a paid solicitor, which is what this is, and a fundraising professional. AFP, for instance, has a requirement in our Code of Ethics that fundraisers cannot be compensated based on a percentage of dollars raised. It cannot be. Paid solicitors are compensated that way. And in all of the cases where you have the high-profile cases where you have this issue come up is where a solicitor has been paid based on a percentage of dollars raised. Fundraising professionals cannot be compensated that way and should not be compensated that way. It doesn't mean that they can't have incentive compensation as long as it's not based on a percentage of dollars raised. So your question is a valid one. It has to do with compensation, not how much money is going into the program, although that obviously is part of that equation. So I think it's a good question to ask. I ask the question when I get calls. Most organizations, with the exception of the ones that Art has alluded to, don't use it as acquisition. It's too expensive, telephone solicitation. Most use it to upgrade donors. Most use it to renew donors. And universities use students, for the most part, in their calling programs. And that's free labor. Kids call it slave labor, but that's a different story. But they're quite effective at that. So there is a difference between a paid solicitor, and I believe there's even legal language on this as well as accounting language. So there is a difference between a paid solicitor. But fundraising professionals should never be compensated based on the amount of money they're raising. If that were the case, I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere in the south of France with a very big chateau.
What about bonuses for fundraising professionals that fall in that?
That's certainly allowable, absolutely, as long as it's not based on a percentage of dollars raised.
What do you mean? Can you elaborate?
Well, I mean, you're not going to be compensated based on achieving a particular goal. In other words, you won't get a percentage of that goal. So if the goal is, there are other ways to do it. But if the goal is $1 million and you hit that goal, you don't get 10% of that. And by the way, donors hate that. They absolutely hate it, and for the obvious reasons. And the principle behind this is anytime you motivate an individual based on the amount of money that they're going to earn, you run the risk of putting their interest, the individual's interest, ahead of the donor and the institution.
Can you give any examples of other types of goals that would be appropriate?
Oh, sure. Sure. Percentage of salary or fee is very acceptable. When one of the services AFP does, the Ethics Committee does, is review incentive compensation plans. But percentage of salary or fee if you achieve a goal, for instance. So you've met your fundraising goal, you would get 5% of your salary or 2% of your salary, whatever the number might be. I've seen very elaborate ones, the weight and rate system where you're weighting the types of fundraising and you're rating those fundraising programs based on a whole set of variables within each area. I've seen them very sophisticated and very simple. The simplest thing to do is a percentage of salary or fee.
So in other words, it could still be tied to the total amount of dollars raised and benchmarks in raising those dollars. It's just that you can't calculate the bonus or commission based on a percentage of those dollars. It has to be a percentage of something else or some other measure. Is there a question right here?
Yes, I'm Russell McKinley of Private Foundation, and I have a question about the audit report. The income is below the $250,000 threshold.
Yep.
I don't, because I'm below that, I don't use the audit. But I do use the CPA, especially for part of the board of the association. Would that meet your requirement?
It would. And the specific report we would look for is a review, a limited review of your financial statements. And I believe if you're below $100,000, then we would accept a compilation of your financial statements.
Okay. I didn't see any questions from the chat feature, so to keep things moving along, Art, thank you very much, and we're going to turn it over to my colleague Crystal and Losen to talk to us about some of the legal aspects of nonprofit fundraising.
Would everyone like to take a little break and just stand up for a couple of seconds before I start? I know you've been sitting for a while, so that might be a good idea.
Just don't leave the room. We're only going to break for about 2 minutes.
Go ahead and gather.
My email address is here. It should be on the, yeah, it's at the very bottom. Okay. And you can email me. And
done by 3.
I'm going to speed through. I'm a fast talker.
All right, if everyone can grab your seats, we're going to get started.
Should I start again? Or?
Yeah.
I'm Crystal and Lawson. I work here at Venable. And for the people on the phone line, I'm sorry I didn't press unmute. I'm basically going to just be giving a very broad overview of the laws related to fundraising because there's a lot of them and they're very detailed. And then if there's something that you have a specific question on, we can address that at the end. So keeping in the time frame, I'm going to move on ahead. This is the agenda that we'll be talking about, but you can just see as I move along. So we're going to start with state regulation of fundraising. And there are basically 3 types of entities that are regulated, which kind of touches on our previous conversation, the charities, the professional fundraisers, and the commercial co-ventures. And I'll touch on each briefly. We'll start with the charitable organizations. These are your typical 501c3 organizations. And looking at the attendee list, this is probably the type of organization that most of you are representing. The triggering definition here for the states that do regulate charitable organizations is a solicitation. And a solicitation is an affirmative ask for a gift or a contribution or the selling of goods and services that will benefit a charitable cause. And this is usually very broadly defined by the states. It usually can say by any means necessary, and it often includes grant solicitations, which sometimes trips up some of our clients. There are usually exemptions to these state statutes. They're listed there, such as religious organizations, organizations that are soliciting only to their members, and that's a usually defined membership. You can't say, oh, because you gave us money in the past, now you're a member, and now we don't have to register because we're only soliciting to you. So it's usually a bona fide interest, like a voting interest. Also, if you're raising funds in the name of one individual, for example, for medical treatment or something like that, that's usually an exemption. Recognizing that this is very broad, the Uniform Registration Statement was developed, and this was an effort to create one form that you could submit to a lot of different states. And while it was a very good effort, the reality is that you cannot still submit that one form. There's usually a bunch of other addendum that you need. So the reality is you can't make one packet and send it on off but it is helpful for those states that do accept it. And the website is there. They have a lot of resources on the Uniform Registration Statement. When you are triggering the charitable solicitation statute, there are usually some common requirements in the state statutes. Those include registration, which we talked about, renewal, which is usually annual, sometimes it's biannual, disclosures when soliciting. For example, I'm a charity and I need to identify myself, say where I'm from, the address, and sometimes acknowledge that financial reports are available upon request. And it seems like the traditional forms of soliciting through the phone or going in person or by mail, that's pretty clear that that triggers the state statute and you have to register there. It gets a little murkier when you look at internet solicitations. Almost every charity now has a button on their website, usually their homepage, that says donate now, use PayPal, use Google Checkout. And the question is, when does that trigger? If I'm in Tennessee and the charity's located in New York, and I just click on that button, is that the charity soliciting me? Does that charity now have to register? And so the National Association of State Charity Officers got together and tried to develop a set of principles, a voluntary set of principles to decide when internet solicitation, passive solicitation, triggered registration requirements. This has only been adopted by a couple of states into statutes, but a lot of state attorney general's offices use it as a guideline, so we find it to be a helpful guideline for our clients. And the basic idea behind the Charleston principles is that if the charity is domiciled in that state, if that's where your principal place of business is, you should be registered there. Also, if you're sending mail into that state or you're approaching donors in that state, you're soliciting there, you should register. But if you're only using passive solicitation on the internet, you should register in states where you're specifically targeting donors. An example, if it's the Florida Coastline Association and they're trying to help the Florida beaches, it's likely that even if the charity for some reason wasn't located in Florida, that you're targeting donors in that area because that's the geographic focus. And also if you receive a repeated and ongoing set of contributions on a substantial basis, and this can be in frequency and amount, there is a suggested guideline in the Charleston principles of $25,000 from a certain state or 100 donors, but those are, again, just guidelines. You should definitely make sure that you're checking the state statutes. But those are just some ideas, and we get a lot of questions that seem to look like law school examination questions with a set of facts. Charities located in one state, and they're sending mail in different states. Donors are coming in from states from the internet, and they're doing their grant giving in other states. So the question is, where do they register? Pretty simple if you just look at the steps. So first, this example, the organization is located in Texas. Bingo, you got to register there. States where you're sending mail or email messages. Seems a little burdensome, but that's how the statutes are written. You should register anywhere you're sending mail or email solicitations. And then again, where you're receiving substantial or contributions on a repeated and ongoing basis, which is a little bit gray, but you can look at the state guidelines and try to figure out where you should be registered. And as you can imagine, for a charity that looks and does this analysis, usually they come up with a lot more states than they would like to be registered in. And the reality is, if you strictly interpret those laws, you will have to register in a lot of states. But practically, it does involve a cost-benefit analysis of kind of looking at where are the states where you're most active in, which states are most active in enforcing their charitable solicitation laws, and what are the potential risks. So that's something that you'll be wanting to assess and perhaps talk to your legal counsel about. So the second category of entities that are registered are the professional solicitors, which is who we were just talking about. And I just wanted to say that sometimes it's not that the organization is bad for using professional solicitors. Sometimes they just don't have paid staff. And we see that a lot, where it's a lot more manpower to use a fundraising company. But the states definitely keep a close eye on professional solicitors, even more so sometimes than charities. And a professional solicitor is usually defined as someone who solicits the general public on behalf of a charity, or somebody who has custody and control of the funds at any point. So if you meet one of those requirements, you would have to register. And there is an exemption for people who are employees of the charities usually, or volunteers. Also, professional fundraising counsel is another category that some states regulate, and those are the people who help plan or devise the fundraising campaign, but they're not the ones on the phone. They're not actually mailing anything. They're just helping you organize your fundraising campaign. And about 20 states do require those types of entities to register. About 41 states in total require professional solicitors or professional fundraising counsel to register. They usually require a posting of a bond, which is, again, evidence of a little bit of more scrutiny on the professional solicitors and the charities. Filing of contracts with the charities, that states can make sure that everything is in writing and the charity knows what it's getting into, and also disclosures. And then even if the contract isn't required to be filed with the state, it's a good idea to have some mandatory principles in the contract, such as, and some of these are regulated by the states, they're mandatory, the charity's right to rescind the contract for a specific amount of time, that the gross collections are delivered to the charity so that the professional fundraiser doesn't get to take their cut before the funds go to the charity, and that the donor list remains the intellectual property of the charity. That's something that's key because the intellectual property of an organization, of a charity, is most of the time one of its most valuable assets. So you want to make sure you're not just giving that away in a commercial transaction. Talking about commercial transactions, we touched on this briefly as well. Commercial co-ventures are often regulated by states. And a commercial co-venture, like we explained before, is an arrangement where a charity and a commercial entity undertake a joint advertising or sale or marketing campaign where the commercial entity usually has the rights to the charity's name and logo to use that in connection with the sale of a product or a service that will benefit a charity or a charitable purpose. And that's just an example. The Macy's example was a perfectly good one too. I just saw this one this morning in Starbucks. It seems like Starbucks, in my personal opinion, is just excellent at doing these sorts of commercial co-ventures. You walk in and everything they sell is going to some cause. So if you're looking for a good example, that might be one. And about 20 states also regulate commercial co-ventures. The common requirements are, again, registration, bonding, a written contract, advertising disclosures, which we touched on earlier, how much is going to the charity, for what time frame is it going to be for, and accounting and record keeping. Oftentimes, the commercial entity and the charity have to keep records for a specific amount of time, not to be filed, but to just be kept if there is ever an audit or if the state ever wants to investigate. And again, even if this type of contract with the commercial co-venture doesn't have to be filed with the state, it's the same sort of terms that you're going to be wanting to include. Branding and intellectual property, again, a term and termination to make sure this campaign isn't going on forever. Maybe it's great and very successful, maybe not. Maybe you're going to want to get out of it. So especially if it's a beginning campaign, you'll want a shorter term. Representations and warranties regarding compliance with laws, such as that the commercial entity will register in the states that it's supposed to. And there are several other ones, but you'll have this PowerPoint, so if you have any questions about the rest, you can ask me. So moving on ahead to federal tax treatment. There's a state and there's a federal component to solicitations. And these are the different gift rules. Probably the fundraising professionals who are here understand that to make a charitable contribution that's going to be deductible on your income tax, you need two different requirements. The first is a donative intent. And that doesn't mean, yes, I truly believe in this cause. It just means that I'm not receiving anything in consideration for my donation. It's a gift. And also, if I am receiving anything in return, that there's some sort of excess fair market value there, and that excess is the donative portion that's deductible. And the federal income tax rules require different record-keeping requirements. The first is the general record-keeping requirement. That's the donor responsibility, and that was added anytime after 2006. The donor has to keep a record of either a written communication from the charity or bank records to be able to substantiate the gift at a later date. And again, the donor would keep that. They don't have to file it with their income tax returns, but they have to be kept on file. The second is a substantiation requirement. This is for any donation that's over $250. The donor has the responsibility of seeking from the charity a substantiation requirement, which will list the value of the donation or a description of the property. You don't have to estimate the value of the property, but a good description is important. And also it will say whether or not the donor received any goods or services in return from the charity, and if so, a fair market value of those goods and services. And then relatedly is the quid pro quo disclosure statement, the this for that statement. If the charity provides any goods or services, they have to provide this statement to the donor, and it will tell whether goods or services were provided and a good faith estimate of those goods or services, and then it will state that the only value that's deductible is the difference between the goods and services provided and the donation. And that's actually the charity's responsibility to provide, and there could be penalties for each instance that the charity does not provide that statement within a certain limit. And so that was a very quick overview. There's a lot of different exceptions and rules, so you can see the IRS publication 1771. It's available on their website. And if you're in fundraising and you haven't checked out the IRS website, they have a lot of helpful materials. It's not all boring information, so I would encourage you to visit it. So moving on ahead, this is a rather detailed portion of the law, the capital campaign interaction with tax-exempt financing. But I just wanted to touch on it to flag the issue in case you are organizing a capital campaign or thinking about tax-exempt bonds. And the basic idea is that if you have a capital campaign and the capital campaign is raising money for building, and you're seeking tax-exempt bonds for that same building, that could be a problem, because if there's a sufficiently direct nexus between the two, if you're raising funds for the same purpose, then the bonds could either not issue, or if the bonds were issued, the interest that the investors are receiving on the bonds could become taxable. That's what's referred to as the nuclear option. You never want that to happen. So when you're planning your capital campaigns, that's just something to think about. Consult with your legal counsel and try to see if there's a way to raise funds for a more broad purpose with greater discretion on the behalf of the charity. So those are the two next bullet points. If you're designing solicitation materials for, say, a capital campaign, I used to be a fundraiser, and we were doing a campaign to do early childhood education, and part of that was the building of a center for early childhood education. I'm pretty sure that the organization was seeking tax-exempt bonds for that child care center, the building. So in the solicitation materials, I remember we were very broad. We were talking about our purposes and that we wanted to raise money for education and children, not for that specific building, to avoid that sufficiently direct nexus. And also relatedly, in general publicity, you want to make sure, again, you're not saying, we're having this 5-year campaign for the Early Childhood Education Center to be named blah, 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 because then you can't seek bonds for that same purpose. So again, that's just briefly touching on it. If there are more detailed questions, we'll be able to answer them later. Also, a federal tax area of the law that is implicated a lot with fundraising is the unrelated business income tax and corporate sponsorship. So the basic idea, of which baseline everyone should be aware, is that organizations that are 501c3 organizations have to be organized and operated exclusively for tax-exempt purposes, which means, according to the regulations, that the substantial part of the activities has to be related to the tax-exempt mission. And even if you have an insubstantial amount of activities, even though you may not be at risk for having your 501c3 status revoked, you still would have to pay tax on those activities. So a basic example, if you are an organization that's tutoring children, low-income children, and that's your tax-exempt purpose, if you also sell T-shirts throughout the year to raise money, even though you do need that money, you need the money to buy books and tutor children, that's not really related to your tax-exempt purpose. So the money from those T-shirts, if it's considered UBIT, which is regularly carried on trade or business, that's not substantially related to your tax-exempt purpose, and there's rulings on each of those 3 steps, if it's considered UBIT, you could pay tax on it. So this comes into play when you're getting big corporate sponsorships. In the past, organizations would seek corporate sponsorship and want to provide some sort of recognition to the organization, such as publishing their name and saying, thank you for being our sponsor. But sometimes it goes over the edge towards not only saying, thank you for being our sponsor, you're saying, let's say Starbucks is the greatest coffee ever, and we are so happy that they've donated to us, and we would only go to Starbucks for our coffee. Then it crosses over, and that's an obvious example, but then it crosses over into advertising. So there is an exception to the unrelated business income tax for qualified sponsorships when it meets that definition found in the code 513I, if you're only providing insubstantial benefits in return or an acknowledgement. So you can provide token items to the corporation for their gift. You can say, thank you for sponsoring our event, and then you would not pay tax on that income, that contribution. But if you cross over the line into advertising, you can. So that's just one area to be aware of with your corporate contributions.
And Kristen, let me just kind of add on to that. Essentially what the qualified corporate sponsorship exception says is that if you're going to acknowledge your sponsor, merely acknowledge the sponsor and not advertise the sponsor's products or services, then that is simply an acknowledgement of a contribution, and the income will still be treated as contribution income and therefore tax-free and not subject to unrelated business income tax. Whereas if you receive money for advertising, that money is almost always subject to unrelated business income tax. Further, the IRS issued very helpful, very detailed regulations, including scores of examples of where the line is drawn between acknowledgement and advertising. And there's actually some very helpful things in there that say you can acknowledge a sponsor by giving the sponsor's name, using their logo, giving their contact information. You can even have a link to their website. You can have non-qualitative descriptions of whatever products and services they sell, but you cannot include price information. You can't include an endorsement. You can't include some inducement to go buy the product or services. You can have exclusive sponsorships. There's a lot of things that you can do without kind of crossing that line. If you want more details on that, on our website we have a lot of articles, but we have one on the qualified corporate sponsorship rules that lays out all those rules in detail. And actually, why don't I give that to you now if you want to write this down. We have about 500 different articles and PowerPoint presentations on every major nonprofit legal issue, including a lot of the things that Crystalline's talking about here today. If you go to www.venable.com/nonprofits/publications, venable.com/nonprofits/publications, you'll see a lot more on UBIT and corporate sponsorships and royalties and endorsements and everything else. You can search by topic area. Anyway, I think we had a quick question here, and then we got to keep moving.
Ancillary to that, so then the corporation will be able to take a charitable deduction of advertising.
Well, the question is, if it's a qualified corporate sponsorship, does that mean the donor can take a charitable deduction as opposed to a business expense deduction? The interesting thing is that the two are completely unrelated. It doesn't matter. That there is a separate standard and test as for whether the donor is eligible for a charitable contribution as opposed to taking a business tax deduction. Frankly, a business tax deduction tends to be a little more valuable because there's no limits on it. So if someone wants, but it really tends to be driven by where the money's coming from. Is it coming from the sponsor's marketing budget, or is it coming from their foundation or their donation budget where they want to play up the number of donations they make? They can do it from either way. It doesn't matter how your nonprofit treats it for tax purposes. It has no impact on how the sponsor treats it for their tax deductibility purposes.
And they would probably, if you're dealing with a large corporation, they might have their own counsel who would be able to advise them on that issue. And again, it's just another lawyerly answer of it depends, but we'd be happy to look into it further with you at a later date. And
it's certainly important for you as a nonprofit and even your nonprofit's lawyers to not be giving advice to the donors on their tax deductibility because it generally depends on factors that you have no knowledge or control over, so it would be very dangerous for you to do that.
Okay, we'll move on ahead to raffles and sweepstakes. I was considering other forms of fundraising, what else you'd be looking towards, and what other rules you're touching upon, because a lot of times you think of, okay, I'm doing fundraising, I'm registering with the state, this looks like fundraising, this is fine, when in fact there's a lot of other regulations that you have to look at, and sweepstakes and raffles are one example. So most states have rules governing raffles. Usually they will prohibit having lotteries, which is a specifically defined term in those statutes, but they allow certain charitable gaming activities. And when they allow certain charitable gaming activities, they go into really interesting detail at describing exactly what the card games are that you're allowed to do, and often will require a permit for those to occur. So a permit's different than charitable registration for general solicitation because it requires you to designate where you're going to be having this activity, what time, and a specific date. It's not for the entire year whenever you want to do it. And each statute's different, each state, so you'll want to make sure that you look at the individual states. And usually they also have a charitable de minimis exception if you're only doing one raffle for a certain amount of money, but you could be tripped up, so make sure you look at that state. And with charities, raffles, and sweepstakes, there's also federal tax law implications. Again, it might be considered unrelated business income tax if the bingo's a bad example, but if the card game is not related to your tax-exempt purpose, the money that you receive could be subject to taxation. There are some exceptions related to that with bingo games and also games that are conducted solely by volunteers, and the code on that is 513A1 and 513F. And also the Form 990, the form that the charities file every year with the IRS, has a separate schedule for listing gaming income if it's over $15,000. So that's another thing that you'll want to be aware of if you're conducting those activities. And also there's maybe private benefit concerns. For example, if you're paying a bingo hall to conduct this activity regularly, and you're funneling a lot of money, you're receiving income, but a lot of it's going back to this private organization to conduct these activities, the IRS could look unfavorably at that. So you'll just want to make sure that you're careful with that. Also, mobile giving is an area of the law that's very hot right now, but it's also an area that's technology is ahead of the law. We're trying to fit different laws, we're trying to fit texting into different laws, such as the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. But I don't want to go into great detail because this is a complicated area of the law, but you should just be aware that the Telephone Consumer Protection Act is applicable to charities, and it basically says that you can't use automatic dialing systems or pre-recorded calls when you're making calls to wireless devices, cell phones, and text messages have been found to be calls. So you can't go ahead and just mass text people that you don't have prior express consent. And it's also important that if I'm the Red Cross and I receive express prior consent, I can't then transfer that to another organization that I later pair up with. It has to be from the organization specifically that's sending the text message. So again, if you have questions, I can answer them later. And there are carrier rules and regulations for text-to-give campaigns. Usually you have to be of a certain size and be in existence for a certain amount of time to be able to do that. And then finally, social media is another hot area of the law. It's also another area of the law where the technology is out there and people are conducting their campaigns, but the law hasn't really caught up with it. However, you should make sure that you look at the site where you're doing the charitable solicitation or promotion and look at their rules and regulations. This is a contractual provision, and although it may be a small chance that you'll actually be sued by Facebook, you could be kicked off of Facebook, which is almost worse for an up-and-coming charity to have that badge on them that they're not on Facebook. So again, they can also trigger the statutes for sweepstakes and charitable registrations for solicitations, and the income could be subject to taxation for these sorts of activities. So again, issues you'd want to explore. So that basically wraps up our brief journey through a lot of different areas of the law. Are there any quick, specific questions?
I had a specific question regarding the raffle. If you're at an event and you're selling raffle tickets, for let's say just a $100 gift card to a restaurant, or $5 for raffle ticket, is it tax deductible? But you receive a permit for raffle even at this size?
Yeah. Well, here's the.
Go ahead.
Take that one. First off, is you've got two different sets of rules. One is the federal tax stuff that you just talked about, and whether someone can take a charitable tax deduction for the value of whatever they're giving that might exceed the value of what they get in return. And frankly, typically in a raffle like that, if they have a chance to win a prize, there's probably not going to be any charitable. It's not going to be any. There may be no donative intent, or maybe the value of what they're getting back, the chance to win, is equal to what they're giving. But generally, they're probably not going to care about a charitable tax deduction for that anyway. But what you really do need to focus on is not the federal tax rules. It's the state and sometimes even local rules that govern lotteries and other games of chance, including raffles. And I cannot tell you how many clients we have that think, oh, we're just doing this raffle at our conference, at our trade show to give away, an item that one of our members or supporters donated. It shouldn't be any problem, right? And most of the time, it is a problem. It very much varies state by state and sometimes even city by city, but you need to be sure to consult the local rules on that. Sometimes it varies based on the type of organization you are, 501c3 versus C6, even the type of 501c3 you are. Sometimes you have to get an advanced license in advance, and sometimes you can't do it at all. Or sometimes if you get rid of the consideration requirement, and this is almost always the case, if you say, we're asking for a $5 or $10 contribution in order to get a raffle ticket, but if you make clear that people can get a raffle ticket even without giving the money, that eliminates what's called the consideration requirement. That will generally make it not be a raffle anymore or a game of chance, and therefore not covered by the state or local law. One more question here. Yeah, this is far beyond the scope of what we can talk about here today. And we have done many, many programs on those sorts of topics, and would be glad to talk to you more. There is a lot of stuff in that material, a lot of material on that issue on our website. But if you have any specific questions, just get in touch with me later.
Just give us your card, and we'll send you some articles that you can take a look at.
All right, one more question.
Do we have registration? We're in Hawaii and continent, other continents. Going to us, do we have to register?
So you're located in Hawaii, or you're just doing an event there?
We're located in Hawaii.
Okay.
And foundations come to us and are donated. Do we have to register in their state?
It would depend on how the state defines solicitation, because if you're not doing any ask, a magic donor shows up in Hawaii and hands you money, the solicitation is likely to only be in Hawaii. However, if you're writing letters and you're applying for grants and there's correspondence back and forth with that foundation in another state, that might trigger the solicitation requirements in the other state and would require registration. Subject to, a lot of states do have, if you're under a certain threshold of fundraising nationally, you don't have to register, so you'll want to check out the exceptions too.
Okay. Kristen, well, thank you very much. And our final speaker is Lee Klump from BDO. And I apologize, Lee. It seems like every time we do one of these programs, you get the last speaking slot and get the short amount of time. I apologize.
It's always the accountant who's between you guys and happy hour, right? But I mean, it's great. There's been a lot of terrific dialogue up here today. I'm very honored to share the dais with so many incredible people in this field. Hopefully, you guys can walk away with a lot of great information. I'm not going to cover all the slides that are in my presentation for two reasons. When we were putting together the presentation today, we were trying to figure out, well, what's the audience going to look like? And the audience is very diverse. We didn't know how many people we would have from the development side versus CFOs and controllers versus, general counsel and others. But I want to cover a couple of real quick things that are very important in contributions. In order to have a contribution, you have to have an irrevocable intent to give, okay? I wrote formal up here because as an auditor, I want some kind of evidence, okay? Now, a little story about evidence. When I first started auditing nonprofits years ago, I audited a Catholic high school here in D.C. that's no longer in existence, and I'll probably let you figure out which one it was. And I'm going to change the name to protect the innocent because he's still around. But Father Joe, who was the development person for this high school, he was great. He knew everybody in town. If you went to a Catholic high school in Washington, D.C. or Northern Virginia or Maryland, he had your name somehow. I guess he had a list of all the altar boys from way back when. And he was great for lunch. He would call people up and take them to lunch, and he would get them to give. He was a great fundraiser for the high school and other causes in the diocese. But here's how Father John did his documentation of donations. There would be a napkin for the restaurant. It would have my name, Lee Klump, $100, okay, and it would have the date and the time, okay? And he would take that into the accounting office and hand it to him and say, here, record this pledge, okay? Now, Father John was really good about getting the cash out of my pocket and getting me to pay for lunch, too. But the funny thing is when I first started this job, 116, 117, which are the FASBs that kind of regulate nonprofit industry, had just come out. And so we had some changes going in. I was looking at the cash receipts and the contribution files, and there was all these napkins in them. Okay. He was very frugal. He uses someone else's paper. Okay. Now, some of them were pledge receivables, and that just wasn't enough documentation. We've come a long way since Father John, okay? But the key is we want some kind of formal documentation. We want some kind of letter. In today's world, email is becoming more and more an acceptable means, but we'd like to see some kind of collaborative evidence behind that. The other side of it is contributions come from everybody. They can come from individuals, as we talked about, foundations, corporations. Anybody is a target for giving, okay? But as Paulette so eloquently pointed out, giving is a people-to-people relationship, okay? So we're looking for a letter thanking that person from the organization for their contribution, maybe a letter saying what the contribution's about. And that's where we really get into it, because that documentation stream is very important, okay? Having the files and the systems and the process that Paulette talked about in place to show the documentation is what guys like me are looking for, okay? Because what we want to know, are these donations that are coming in, these contributions, are they for general use or are they restricted, okay? Is it a vendor type of relationship or a split interest agreement or something else? And those are all different conversations, okay? And I could talk for several hours on this whole topic, but we're gonna focus right on contributions, okay? We really want to distinguish between a conditional pledge and a restricted pledge. If I say I'm going to give $100 to the DC Humane Society, and I don't say what it's for, and I say I'll write you the check next week, it's a pretty good pledge. It'd be nice if I sent it to you in an email or wrote you a letter, but that would be pretty good. Okay? Not restricted, probably from what I told you right there, it's for general use. But if I turn around and say I'm going to give you $100 if there's another earthquake in Los Angeles, okay, then the question becomes whether it's certain or uncertain. Okay, well, I got $20 in my pocket that says there's going to be another earthquake in Los Angeles. It's a pretty certain event, okay? But if I say there's going to be I'll give you $100 when there's another earthquake in Columbia, Maryland. There's been 2 in the state of Maryland in the last 40 years. We're not so certain when that's going to happen. Another one would be if $100 if the sun rises tomorrow. a pretty certain event, okay? Now, the way the clouds have been the past couple of days, we may not be able to see it, but somewhere in the world, the sun is going to rise tomorrow. We need to look at that. We need to make sure, in order to record a contribution, that it's not conditional. If there is a condition attached to it, you cannot record it, okay? So if I say I'm going to give you $100,000, okay, if you raise another $100,000, a matching contribution, can't record the $100,000 until we can make the match. Now, a lot of times it's all the devil's in the details, okay? And lawyers are really good at helping us ferret that out, okay? Because the thing about it is you might want to have Jeff turn around and write that agreement between me and the organization so that I am matching at certain points in time, okay? So when you raise the first $50,000, I match the $50,000, okay? That would help, okay? That may turn around and get some revenue in the year you're trying to get revenue in, okay? But it's really important. We're going to look at all the detail. Someone turned around and handed me a document the other day and said, here's an agreement on a contribution. It's restricted, okay? I started reading it. I go, well, it's really hard to understand the donor's intent. What else do you have? You know, just this document. And I said, no, there's more to it than this. So I happen to know this client fairly well, and I kind of bypassed the person who had come in my office, and so I called up the vice president of fundraising for the organization, and I said, Jerry, what do you have that you can share with me on this? Because I'm trying to get down. Jerry turned around and sent me a zip file that took me like 20 minutes to print out all the detail on this one donor. I got down to it pretty quickly. It was a restricted contribution, okay? We're going to look at emails. We're going to look at other types of agreements that may be there, other correspondence, because the legal agreement may not turn around and be the only thing that may turn around and lead to us what the frame of mind of the donor was. And remember, as we talked about earlier today, the frame of the donor may end up in court one day as their intent, like we talked about with the University of Chicago or Princeton, okay? We don't want to have those types of things because the one thing that's expensive in this world is going to court. We always try to turn around and not do that, okay? Sorry if I just took your revenue stream, Jeff. But Jeff will even tell you he doesn't want you to go to court, okay? It's much better to work it out. But the funny thing is, okay, we got to be careful with recording contributions because although it's an irrevocable pledge, okay, and legally it's upholdable, okay, and it's probably not a word. I'd probably make that, but legally you could support that. But the reality of it is I've never heard of, and I'm sure there has been, a nonprofit who sued a donor for not making a pledge, okay? Because the reality of it is the nonprofit does not want to turn around and have that hitting the front page of the Washington Post. There's other ways that we can work around that. But you don't want to turn around and record a pledge on your books that you may have to turn around and write off at a later date, okay? First of all, if it's material, it could create all kinds of nasty accounting issues that we don't even want to talk about. But the other side of it is it creates a lot of not goodwill with donors. And guess what? If I have a problem with a donor and a pledge, guess how many people he's going to tell about it or she's going to tell about it? We don't really want to go there. Distinguishing between a contribution and exchange transaction is very important, okay? Because some contributions may look like exchange transactions. The example I have in here is the federal government, okay? With the federal government, a lot of people believe that any work you do with the federal government, like a grant or is a contribution. Some people treat it as an exchange transaction, okay? The government has never given anything away for free, okay? Believe that. But the reality of it is we have to look at it. I actually work with several of the public radio stations around the country, and we look at their money. They get a lot of money from an organization called CPB, and a Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and it's federal money that's coming through. Well, it's unrestricted support money. We look at that as a contribution. But then they get money from foundations and others to put on or support programmatic activity. And in some cases, depending on what that is and what the rights are and what the donor gets back in return, that may be an exchange transaction. But with the federal government, I know one particular public radio station that actually gets money to produce a program. And they actually look at that and go, well, that program has certain rights, and the other public broadcasting stations get to use that program around the country. Therefore, it's an exchange transaction. We're providing a service to the federal government. So we have to look at that very carefully. How do you account for an unrestricted contribution? Well, we want a formal, committed, or writing. We're going to record a receivable. We're going to have some revenue. And inside this presentation, there are some debits and credits. That way we could actually give CPE on this. Okay. But formal commitments. To audit the contribution, we're going to review those agreements and stuff, as I said earlier. The contribution receivable, here's the big deal. Long-term receivables are going to have to be discounted based on the present value. We just want to turn around and think about that as we're going forward. We also want to think about the receivable in calculating that discount. It's going to be amortized over the life. So there's a lot of things as fundraising professionals we need to do with accounting. Okay, you can't raise funds for a nonprofit without having a three-legged stool. And the three-legged stool is the accounting department, the fundraising department, and general counsel. Together, the strength is incredible. Individually, you can have chaos and turmoil. Okay, if you have, and I've seen this in other organizations where you've got a general counsel that's internal, that's a little heavy-handed in how things are going to be recorded and how things are going to. There's always problems. There's always something going on. You can have a CFO who's the same way, so it's not always general counsel. Or you can have a fundraising firm. And I've seen each of the hats in organizations have that heavy hand. It's got to be an orchestrated process. It's got to have collaboration and commitment from all parties involved. And then you could actually have a pretty good fundraising. I'm actually going to skip through the special events section. That's pretty self-explanatory. And gifts in kind, which I've also. The one that I want to really talk about is the quest. Okay. Right now, a lot of people are a little strapped for cash. And getting people to give you $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in major funds is from a major donor is pretty hard. But people say, you know, I'll turn around and put you in my will. I will turn around and do other things. With the bequest, you cannot record a bequest when you actually receive the bequest. When you're notified that I've left your organization $100,000 in my will, that's conditional. It's conditional upon my death. I'm 49 years old. According to the actuaries, I'll probably live till I'm about 75, okay? So I got a few more years to live, and who knows, by the time I'm 75, I may live forever, okay? My kids won't like that, but I may live forever, okay? Unfortunately, you cannot record a bequest at what point you receive it, okay? That is a conditional pledge, and you have to look at it. Pledges should be recorded as soon as the organization receives the pledge and the condition has been lifted. So, upon notification from my attorney that I am now 6 feet under, okay, no longer breathing, okay, and that you can estimate what the pledge is worth. Okay, so I said $100,000. My estate took a big dip in 2008, so it's only worth $50,000. Upon that notification and the fact that you know that my will has cleared probate, okay, then you can actually record the pledge. Recording bequest requires a really strong process of internal controls within the organization. You need to have a really strong contact point within your organization. A lot of times that's general counsel, okay, because there's a lot of legal agreements that are going back and forth, okay? But you need to have a process in place, and it needs to involve the three-legged stool, okay? That's very important. But the questions you should ask are there other beneficiaries? Okay, has the estate cleared probate, and are there any claims of disinherited relatives? Now, I worked with an organization a number of years ago, and they had a letter show up from a law firm out on the West Coast one day. It told them that they were party to receive a donation of $30 million. Now, that would probably make almost every development person in this room weep, right? what was really important was the first time they had ever heard about it. And the person was now deceased, and it was pretty good they were going to collect it, okay? They actually went back and looked at their records, and over the prior 25 years, they had received $750 and $25 contributions from this donor. So that was a pretty nice gift, okay? The reality of it is they knew about, there were two other beneficiaries, but their cut of it was $30 million. There was a $90 million estate. They also knew that the estate had cleared probate already, okay? So they was pretty sure what they were going to get. What they didn't know about was there was a disinherited nephew, and he was turning around and making a whole lot of claims, evidently. They were trying to get the guy to go away, okay? But even after it cleared probate, there was all these things going on. So they had to wait another about 8 months before they could actually record the pledge, okay? They weren't sure exactly what the dollar amount was going to be. Okay, the other piece of this is, I sometimes refer to the F word, okay? Oh, I'm sorry. And it's not the word that you guys are thinking about. It's fraud, okay? And for the auditors in the room, okay, and Art talked about it, okay? The biggest area where we have a risk of fraud in a nonprofit organization is related to the allocation of expenditures related to fundraising. There are some really specific rules around it, okay? And it's called joint cost allocation. It refers to an SOP 98-2. I'm sure nobody really wants to hear about that late on Friday afternoon. However, in the slide deck there is some information about it. And what I'm going to tell you is that you need to be really careful in allocating joint costs. And if you're an auditor, if you've got a client who allocates joint costs, okay, and is doing a lot of fundraising, it needs to be a consideration for a fraud risk, because I can turn around and manipulate anyone's financial statements with joint cost allocation, okay? Because we've turned around and we've really focused in on ratios and how much money I'm spending on fundraising versus programmatic activity. It's become part of our culture, and it's been promulgated by a lot of different people, and I'm not going to get into that conversation. But the reality of it is we've got to be very, very careful in this area. If you're an organization and you're talking about figuring out how to move more expenses out of fundraising into your program area, okay, you need a methodology. It needs to be systematic. It needs to be applied consistently, okay? And the other thing is, before you apply it, make your auditors your partner. They know your organization inside and out, and they can tell you where there's holes in your methodology, okay? The other side, there's some great stuff out on Wise Giving's website and just, you know, and on the internet at Charity Navigator. If you go to my website at BDO, I wrote an article in our last month in our Nonprofit Standard, which is a newsletter related to ratios. Ratios can be a good thing. The ratios for the DC Humane Society versus the American Red Cross are not alike at all, okay? We're talking apples to pineapples, okay? They're very, very different, okay? And we need to make sure that when we're doing the joint cost allocation, we're using something that's really specific to our organization and that can be audited, okay? I said what the guidance is. I've defined it. I've got an example here. It relates to a mailer, okay? If you think about all those things you get from, I'm assuming most of the people in the room are from D.C., but and I know we got people in the call, but think about the local public broadcasting station, okay? They always send out these requests with check the box, asking you for your donation, okay? And that mailer, depending on how much educational information is in there, which is related to the program, could be a joint costing activity. You might get something from the Paralyzed Veterans Administration or World Wildlife Fund or the American Red Cross. Look at those things, okay? Those things are very interesting when you start thinking about what cost of this would be fundraising, what would be general administration, and what might be programmatic, okay? The one thing about fundraising expense okay? And there's multiple types of fundraising activities. Fundraising expense is a period cost, okay? There are only a few situations, which are very rare, in which you can capitalize fundraising expense, okay? But fundraising expense is going to hit your P&L in the period in which it is incurred, okay? And just realize you can't go back and fix something if you decide all of a sudden you're going to do things differently, okay? Here's some of the different types of costs, and so that you can kind of differentiate between a fundraising expense and a joint cost, and they're very hard to differentiate. Fundraising consultants, printing and mailing, but you can also have those in joint cost as well. Joint cost has got event advertising and airtime and mailing, and I mean, it's very, very, hard to distinguish between the two. So we just need to be very, very careful on that. Okay. The one thing about fundraising expense, and related to joint costing, if you're going to use joint costing, and this slide is in the deck, and there's more information in the deck about purpose, audience, and content, but you have to have these three things. You've got to meet these criteria. And the biggest place where not-for-profits fall into pitfalls related to joint costing is they fail to have a call to action, okay? Now, I'm going to define a call to action very simply, okay? If I turned around and asked all of you guys to give $100 to the DC Humane Society, okay? I've asked you to do a fundraising thing, okay? If I turned around and said, hey, everybody, we're trying to, help the wildlife in the DC marketplace, would everyone please turn around and put out a little bowl of milk for all the stray kittens in the neighborhood, okay? If that's in the same material where I'm asking for the $25, okay, that's a call to action. Because a call to action is me asking you to do something that doesn't require you to give money. Okay, so I'm the DC Humane Society, and I'm asking you to put something outside for some of the kittens that may be homeless and don't have food, okay? Related to my mission, it has to be related to the mission, but I'm not asking you to give. I'm giving you a call to action. Now, at the same time, there's the check boxes we referred to earlier, and I really would like you to give $150 if you don't mind, but the thing about it is, that's the call to action. The call to action has to be tied into the purpose, audience, and content. The only key thing about the audience is you can't turn around and pick an audience based on their past performance of giving or the fact that you know that they're going to give. And that's key. Okay? There's a lot of ways to do that, and I'm sure some of you guys probably even have some tricks that would even help me do it a little bit better. But the three criteria have to be met in order to do joint costing. Okay. The last piece of this is the allocation methods. And just remember, in joint costing, it needs to be rational, systematic. It needs to be a reasonable allocation and applied reliably given the facts and circumstances. And that is very, very important. Okay. I can come up with multiple methodologies. Okay. But I need to apply consistently and needs to be systematic. Okay, and that's really the important part of it. Okay. Any questions?
So, question has to do with the gifting.
Okay.
So let's say an attorney gives pro bono advice, says it, and lets a donation. That recorded differently if the attorney is on your board versus if you're not.
Okay, let me repeat the question. So the question is the attorney for the organization gives you pro bono services, and how do you record that, and whether it would be different if they're on the board or not on the board? Well, let me take it in this way. I'll do it backwards. If they're on the board or not on the board, it doesn't really matter, okay? If an attorney gives you pro bono services, okay, you can actually turn around and record that as a gift in kind, okay? Here is the thing. If you turn around and you go up and you get the managing partner at Venable to be some pro bono work, and he personally does it, okay? Now, I'm not sure what his billing rate is, but his billing rate is probably a little higher than Jeff's, okay? Which is fine. I'm sorry, Jeff, but the reality of it is, I'm going to throw some numbers out there that we're going to use. Jeff's billing rate's $500 an hour, and his billing rate's $1,000 an hour. The question is what dollar amount do you record the fair value of it is? Well, the reality of it is $1,000 is probably not what you would pay, okay? What you would pay is probably somewhere between Jeff's billing rate or the rate of an associate here and the managing partner, okay? So, you know, it'd be like my firm. If my firm was doing it, you're not going to pay my billing rate. I'm probably not doing the work, okay, on your board. What's a fair value cost of that? It may actually be $650, okay? Because if you looked around, if you were going for a nonprofit attorney, the rates may actually be somewhere between, you know, $500 and $800. So that, you know, the average turned around on the 3 firms that you interviewed, and you decided to use your board member turned around and was $650. You kind of have to turn around and do what the average is. You know, the reality of it is if you're a medical organization, it'd be the same thing. If you're the American College of Cardiology, okay, and the general counsel for Suburban Hospital turns around and comes on your board, it would kind of be the same kind of question. He doesn't have a billing rate, okay, but he's doing general counsel work for you. You'd go out and look and see what the average billing rate was for an attorney for a nonprofit. In my opinion, having general counsel on the board has huge advantages, okay? First of all, nothing will ever end up in the minutes that will get you in trouble. That is the first thing. The second thing is you will move along a lot faster because you won't have to defer to general counsel. You may actually be able to get some advice right then and there. Those are the 2 big ones.
All right, but I have to add, as a lawyer, I can't let you end it in good conscience with that. First off, if you know, a board member is who's an attorney is much more likely to give you pro bono counsel than someone who's not a board member. I mean, it just goes without saying. But you do have to be very careful because while it happens all the time, and there's nothing inherently wrong with it, and it obviously can help save a lot of money, there are conflicts of interest that can arise between that board member's fiduciary duties that he or she owes to the organization as a board member versus the legal counsel that's being provided, which may not be consistent, and in certain circumstances they're not, and we've seen that a lot. It can be very dangerous. I've also seen it be dangerous where that attorney may be, you know, the best employment lawyer in D.C., but he knows nothing about nonprofit tax and fundraising and all the stuff we're talking about here today, and if you are relying solely on that advice, you're likely going to be missing a lot, and you could even be getting really bad advice in certain areas. You just need to be careful about that and try to find an appropriate check and balance between that and perhaps your outside counsel, outside paid counsel. Lastly, the other thing I just want to mention from a tax perspective, you asked about kind of the advantage to the attorney. Just remember that donated services are not tax deductible. So when you donate your time, even if you would otherwise be charging for that time, you cannot take a federal charitable tax deduction for that donated time. You can only take a deduction for out-of-pocket expenses that you incur in rendering those services. Like if you pay your own way to get on a plane to come to a board meeting, you can deduct the cost of the plane and the parking and the cab fare, but you can't take a deduction for the value of your time. All right, with that, we're going to need to wrap it up.
Yeah. Actually, Jeff made a really good point on the one thing about the different types of attorneys. I'm on a board of directors, and we had a nonprofit tax issue that came up, and a couple of my board members got upset because I wouldn't get the advice of one of our board members who's an attorney, who actually happens to be an employment attorney, because the advice, although it was very good advice, you know, we needed to make sure we had the right expertise. So Jeff makes a very valid point about if it's just talking about, you know, general stuff, great. But if we get into specifics, we really need to make sure we have the best counsel possible. And Jeff's number is in the book.
Thank you, Lee. I want to thank all of our panelists. Paulette and Art apologize they needed to leave. Paulette needed to go catch a flight. She flew up from South Carolina just for this today and back right now. We really appreciate that. All of our speakers, Crystal and Lee and Art and Paulette did a great job. Thanks to all of you for sticking around for a long program. We really appreciate it, and thanks for coming. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.